Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second event with our KJC postdoctoral fellow, Diego Baena. It has been an honor to have him affiliated with our center and with NYU this semester. This year, we exceptionally redefined our KJC and Andres Bello Chair as postdoctoral fellowships in an effort to address the challenges facing emerging scholars because of the pandemic. As a result, the KJCC has found itself with two exceptional fellows who are leading us this semester in a rich, layered conversation about issues of great importance. Both Diego Baena, our KJC postdoctoral fellow, and Sebastian Figueroa, our Andres Bello postdoctoral fellow, whose public programs with us begin with a roundtable on March 30th, have contributed generously to the goals of our center, organizing a series of public-facing programs like the one you're watching today, as well as actively engaging with our graduate students to foster a culture of support and engagement that we know will have a great impact on all of us, even after their term as fellows ends this summer. With Diego, we have been introduced to the complexities of pandemics, historically and today, in the dialogue he held with Spanish writer Santiago Alborico in February, in which together they offered a rigorous and far-reaching discussion about the historical and contemporary representations of illness, poverty, and segregation, especially as it pertains to discourses about geography, gender, and capital. Related to his research into Pío Baroja and the threat of cholera in Spain, Diego showed us a rich array of literary and visual sources from the 19th century that resonate still today in the ways that Alborico described the cultures of quarantine and their relation to capitalist modes of control. Today, Diego once again shows us the importance of working with context, literary and visual sources, and local definitions to build a more precise understanding of populisms in historical perspective. His knowledge is expansive and draws on research shared in his dissertation on La literatura y sus pueblos, Demopoéticas de la España liberal, which explores the intersection between popular literacy, various forms of popular media, censorship, and dissident political cultures in 19th century Spain. Joining him today as a respondent is Jorge Gaupp, a scholar of anarchism and socialist mass culture in modern Spain, who, like Diego, has placed great attention on the need to think critically about how dominant narratives and theoretical paradigms have framed our understanding of both mass and class-oriented political cultures over time. Together, they will lead us in engaging dialogue about the dissident cultures of the past, from Utopian Demo-Socialism to the Anarchist Spring. Following their discussion, we will open the session up to questions from the audience. So please put your comments and questions into the comments section on Facebook Live, and we will come back to them following their presentations. Without further comments, please help me welcome virtually, wherever you are listening in, Diego Baena and Jorge Gaupp.
Well, thank you very much, Jordana, for that introduction. Thank you, Jorge, too, for being here with me and with all of us, and thank you to everyone who decided to spend a couple of hours with us, or an hour and a half, this afternoon. And yeah, I think I'll jump right in because I want to get through a lot. So when trying to find potential answers to the question of what populism is or what populism could be, I think it's tempting for historians to invoke the tools of their trade and start by asking what it was or could have been in the past. But trying to answer this question, as I hope to demonstrate in the first part of this talk, is just as problematic. Very briefly, then, before we get to the 19th century as such, let's go over some of the different hypotheses that have been used by various historians and theorists over the years to try to explain what populism is or was. So when I say that populism is polysemic, I mean to say that there is quite simply no single or concise way to define it, but that there are at the same time a few narrative trends that tend to surface in the current academic debate. Let's go over them now, one by one, and later in the discussion round, we can talk about whether or not we agree. So the first prevalent theory responding to the writings of the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt is the idea of populism as a specific kind of religious practice in which political relations are conceived as a constant Manichaean struggle of good versus evil and between imagined friends or enemies of an equally imagined people or political community. In classical anthropological terms, this is the struggle between in-group, perceived in-group, and excluded out-group. In modern day ultranationalism and right-wing populism, it's fairly easy to see who the dangerous outsiders and enemies of the Volk are taken to be. Foreigners, internal ethnic and political enemies, subproletarian malandros, Bolsonaro, losers, Trump, perceived criminals and terrorists, etc. And debates as to the question of what ultimately distinguishes or no right-wing populism from left-wing populism in extreme cases such as fascism and Marxist-Leninism are, as you know, quite old. But of course, this could be the subject of an entire lecture of symposium. So for the time being, let's move on. In the second place, we have the charismatic demagogue or popular tyranny hypothesis, building on the notion of populism as Manichaean theology and borrowing at least somewhat from Marx's notion of the personality cult. This is the intuition that what we tend to call populist mass movements seldom materialize unless explicitly mediated by the presence of a celebrated public personality, also called the charismatic or messianic leader. So the argument goes, there cannot be populism as such unless it is simultaneously accompanied by a call to a popularly beloved prophetic despot. Ergo, populism must be, in this sense, undemocratic and despotic at the ontological level. But I think this too bears some serious discussion. In my mind, we have to be careful with words like tyrant, tyranny, or despotism, particularly when the quote unquote mobs or masses are involved. Not only because the terms mob tyranny and demagogy can and have been invoked by explicitly anti-democratic, oligarchic, and totalitarian regimes as a pretext to silence criticism, but because it is not immediately apparent, at least to my mind, that all populist mass movements automatically flock to demagogues and tyrants, or that they can't at the very least generate their own criticisms of despotism from within. So turning to our third potential definition, we come to Ernesto La Claude, one of the most widely cited critics of populism in modern academia. I don't have time to summarize La Claude's arguments in full or state whether or not I fully agree or disagree with him, but I do think he's important to mention precisely because of how he uses forms of traditional anti-populist critique as a point of departure. Against the demagogy hypothesis, for example, the intuitive definition of populism as passionate popular excess or mob violence and tyranny, La Claude proposes the following tentative counterpoints. Basically, that populism is neither an aberration of democracy, nor in every case synonymous with modern totalitarianism, but rather an inextricable organizational element of communal life. In the second place, that populism is not definable through specific discursive and symbolic articulations, but as political praxis. And third, that populism after the Cold War has become less and less framed as the old so-called universal struggle for human rights and more as a kind of polyphonic coalition. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So next we have what I would call the most standard liberal left definition of populism today, the anti-elitist hypothesis. What is populism? Well, it's the opposite of elitism. And this definition rings true, I think, for the great majority of populists who haven't read La Claude as it does for those who have. You can see its importance in slogans like "We are the 99%, highly evocative of some of the first political cultures to explicitly be called populist in modern history, including the so-called populist movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century United States. This definition of populism as a perceived Manichaean struggle of good and evil between those above and those below, excluded and underprivileged majority against hyperprivileged wealthy minority, is highly intuitive and also highly questioned by critics for its supposed dualistic simplicity. Its direct appeal to perhaps outmoded socialist notions of class conflict and political enmity, in this case between rich and non-rich. Personally, I think there's a lot more at play in this language of haves and have-nots, little people against big shots, the excluded against the excluders, than what a simple reading of Carl Schmitt would imply, particularly in a climate of rapidly escalating economic inequality. But it is, I think, the most prototypical expression of populist rhetoric today, and it's pretty commonly found in political and religious mass movements throughout history, regardless of whether we call them populisms or not in the contemporary sense. Next, we have another common critique of populism, which is the notion that populist culture a priori rejects intellectual culture as a form of intolerable elitism in itself. Many of us here, of course, likely share the intuition that popularized anti-intellectual or anti-scientific sentiment is one of the chief obstacles towards creating an informed culture that could truly tackle catastrophes like coronavirus or climate change. But the idea that anti-intellectualism and populism are somehow the same, or that populism is by definition an anti-intellectualist phenomenon, really does bear discussing, as does the question of why there appears to be evident popular skepticism of academic and intellectual elite to begin with. But we'll get into that more in part 2 of the talk, and where we'll see that the phenomenon of popular anti-intellectualism can actually be pretty complex, especially when we consider factors such as educational inequality or the existence of populist cultures with strong intellectual cultures of their own. So this next one is interesting. Arguably the first political philosophy on earth to more or less explicitly call itself populist, which predates even the 1890s American People's Party, was a part of the anarchist and peasant communist movements in Russia in the 1860s and 70s. The general idea was that socialist intellectuals, orators, union reps, teachers, etc., had to fundamentally reverse their understanding of what teaching and leadership and political discussion meant. That a young socialist or anarchist propagandist had a duty to listen and learn from the people he or she spoke with before pretending to represent them, indoctrinate them, or lead them into a potentially violent struggle with various oppressive authorities. In other words, an approach to political organization conceived around local federated assemblies, mutual learning, and public discussion, rather than, say, the dictates of a central committee. This definition of populism, echoed in part later by critical Marxists like Antonio Gramsci and Bertolt Brecht, is interesting because it stands in pretty stark contrast to what we often tell ourselves populism fundamentally is. In other words, not anti-intellectualism, or demagogic appeal by a party apparatus to a group of common people assumed to be ignorant, but rather the idea that ordinary people themselves, regardless of their schooling, are already intellectuals and political agents, and fully capable of demonstrating critical insight and reasoned disagreement. Which brings us, of course, to our last tentative definition of populism. So the notion of populism as inverted classroom we have just used to classify Russian anarchism is doubly interesting because it diametrically opposes our most mainstream ideas of populism today. A kind of pseudo-stoic belief that populism is not but an ideology or the dangerous product of corporate, state, or party propaganda passively consumed by supposedly ignorant or impassioned masses. One of the earliest texts from the canonical Western philosophical tradition that illuminates this quintessentially aristocratic fear of a presumably uneducated multitude is, of course, Plato's Republic, the chapter on education and its lack in human nature, the famous allegory of the cave. We know the story. You have a situation in which people are sitting in a dark cave with no other contact from the outside world than a hole through which a firelight is shining. A puppet master behind the scenes pulls the strings of little wooden figures as they cast moving shadows on the wall. Those watching the shadows inside the cave have no other knowledge of what the world around them could be than what the little shadows tell them, no way of telling reality from simulation and deceit, when their only source of information and enlightenment is little more than puppet theater. This image of existential popular ignorance and distraction, of people being consumed by the media they consume, is repeated again and again throughout intellectual history, and is every bit as alive in the internet age as it was in the time of magic lanterns. So which of these, of all the theories I've mentioned, is the quote unquote proper way to interpret populism? Is it like the Russian anarchists thought, an emancipatory machine, a machine of communal and reciprocal learning against the real ignorance imposed on ordinary people by those in power? Or, on the contrary, the most perfect means of subjugating, manipulating, and seducing a people who are supposed to have no other source of light within reach? I won't try to answer this question for you, but I'll hazard to say that Plato and the Russian anarchists had fundamentally different ideas about what ordinary people knew and about what ordinary people could do in terms of educating both themselves and others. So this list of potential definitions of populism I have just provided is not exhaustive, and I don't expect any of you here to think that this or that theory is the correct one. Hopefully, this little outline I've given can serve as a way of putting us on the same page as to where currently scholarly and philosophical debates are going, and as a way to illuminate just how contradictory populism can be, both as a concept and in practice. But after seeing all these different ways in which we currently grapple with the challenge of defining populism in any precise sense, we're still left to wonder then, what is populism historically? Well, moving on to part 2 of the talk, I believe I've given some possible answers to this question, or at least evidence of how other people have tended to answer, as well as some reasons for which the question itself may be flawed. Populism, I argue, can be many things, sometimes even seemingly contradictory things. Fascism, liberal representative democracy, various forms of both democratic and anti-democratic socialism, anarchism, all seem to have very strong populist elements at play. So what happened then? If all these things are supposedly fundamentally the same thing, if they're all populisms of a kind, why are they in fact so fundamentally different and so often at odds with one another? Why, in short, is populism so difficult to define in any simple or holistic sense? And what do the narratives we use to tell this story tell us about our own perspectives and preconceptions? Before this conversation gets too metaphysical or metahistorical, though both are important, I would like to change course a bit and share with you now in part 2 of the lecture some findings of my own research into what some people have called the historical populisms of the Iberian Peninsula, and others the popular democratic and socialist cultures of the past. So the first tentative theory of historical populism my archive seemed to be questioning was the so-called Messianic figure hypothesis, namely the idea that the first true iterations of populism in modern Spain were directly tied to the cults of personality of key dissidents, politicians, and popular military leaders. My goal wasn't to question the existence of these cults, which is pretty obvious even at first glance, but to critically analyze two symbolic figures of key importance to early liberal, democratic, and socialist culture, that of the popular revolutionary martyr and that of the popular military man. So if you go to the wonderful anarcho-queer Iglesia Católica in Lavapiés in Madrid, you'll discover a rather unconventional canon of saints. Inside, along with many reliquaries dedicated to the Holy Rubber Ducky, you'll see likenesses of Cervantes, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Victor Hugo, Muhammad Ali, Nelson Mandela, Charlie Chaplin, Yuri Gagarin, Mother Teresa, and Mahatma Gandhi, all sharing the same minute sanctuary as members of an imagined canon of global freethinkers. This expanded canon is a modern kind of multicultural twist on a tradition that goes back to the popular dissidences of the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries at both sides of the Atlantic. If one is from Venezuela or from Cuba, for instance, and one has a friend from a left-wing family called Carlos, Fidel, or Vladimir, you suspect that this could be a kind of vestige, a remnant of a socialist liturgy in historically Catholic nations, which effectively transferred the practice of naming one's children after the saint or virgin of the day to naming one's child after the saints and martyrs of past populist revolutions. To give an anecdotal example, there's an old anarchist joke from around the time of the Spanish Civil War. A young anarchist goes to the new revolutionary registry to get his name legally changed. The bureaucrat asks him, "What is your name, compañero?" The young anarchist answers, "Jesús Pedo," literally Jesus fart. The bureaucrat seems to understand perfectly. "Well, compañero," he says, "you've definitely come to the right place." And he asks him, "What would you like your new name to be?" The young anarchist answers unflinchingly, "Bakunin Pedo." To give another anecdotal example from my own family, my great-great-grandfather came from a petty bourgeois family from a very small town in rural Castile, was a school teacher. He was drafted into military service and made into a low-ranking officer for his ability to read and write. He was a progressive liberal and would name his own son Emilio after Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile. My great-great-grandfather proudly fought in the revolution that forced the abdication of the current king's great-great-great-grandmother, Isabella II. In short, he foresaw a certain future for his son. His son was to be the proverbial new man of the enlightened century, where children were no longer named after saints and martyrs long dead, those whom the Catholic Church told you had to revere, but after those who questioned dogma and superstition itself. It's a pretty profound irony that the radical cult to secularism and freethinking should mimic and parody so closely at times the very thing it was rebelling against. So here we have two hagiographies. One is a classical Catholic hagiography, and the other is a revolutionary Jacobin hagiography. These stories of secular martyrs of liberal and Jacobin traditions, real revolutionaries who fought or died on the barricades, later canonized in Republican and socialist propaganda, are evidence of the kinds of personality cults, that we can call them that these more often than not secularist political cultures created to counter and compete with the official propaganda of the church in a historically Catholic and monarchist nation. Needless to say, these cultures also released pamphlets called quite explicitly political catechisms, which would communicate political dogma and the names of leaders to potential adherents through rote memorization. These hagiographic accounts of popular revolutionary leaders and their exploits, which often follow their protagonists from birth to death and eventual martyrdom, as in the case of the biographies of saints, also share a good deal in common with a specifically military hagiography. These were tremendously popular stories for both literate and illiterate audiences. These are allelujahs, primitive comic strips, often sold by blind people and for next to nothing, and they told heroic and tragic tales of perceived heroes and villains of contemporary revolutions and civil wars. These sort of hagiographic pop historical accounts also tend to share many of the same stylistic and narrative tropes as popular romances about outlaws and criminals. Here we see the liberal or conservative military man, espadón or caudillo. Popular cults to these military men have been read by historians like Álvarez Junco as an early permutation of the proto-fascist personality cult in early republicanism and progressive liberalism, comparable in many respects to Bonapartism. And it's not too difficult to understand what he means. Here on the lower right, for example, we see a mass-produced printed image of General Espartero's triumphant entry into Madrid following the popular insurrection of 1854, highly evocative, of course, of other ubiquitous images in liberal and Jacobin liturgy, such as Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Here, however, the abstracted allegory of liberty or the republic, typically depicted as a bold, bare-breasted woman accompanied by commoners in an unrelenting march forward, is complemented by the consecrated body of the popular military man as protector of the ideals the allegories represent. This phenomenon of popular reverence for both the Bonapartist strongman or the precarious revolutionary martyr is important to note, but we cannot at the same time reduce all of populist aesthetic during this time to reverence for these popular personalities. Often enough, for instance, the cults are not to specific personalities, but to ideas. Here, for example, on the left, we see an allegory of social progress and enlightenment, typical of the liberal, utopian socialist, and radical republican imaginaries. This particular print comes from an early socialist novel called Los Hijos del Trabajo, 1866. These idealized allegories of scientific intellectual progress were not separated, however, from concrete materiality. On the contrary, they frequently appeared alongside romanticized images of ordinary hardworking families trying to make ends meet. The second are not only a way of creating cults to a still largely patriarchal nuclear conception of wage labor, but of stating in the most bitingly critical way how the fruits of technological progress and enlightenment were not being shared equally among everyone. We must also remember a crucial second point, namely that irreverent criticism of tyrants and demagogues in popular media is every bit as prevalent as the celebration of certain military and revolutionary heroes and saints. Military men like Espartero and later, most especially, Juan Prim were indeed popular figureheads of 19th century progressive liberalism, but also often severely criticized by populists of varying political stripe for their authoritarianism, their exaltations of state violence, and ultimately their complicity with the political and economic elite. They could be seen as friends and allies of the people only insofar as they didn't betray the ultimate mission of specifically egalitarian emancipation. Here, for example, we see text from a humorous 1840s Pliego de Cordel from Barcelona, clearly from a revolutionary Republican but ultimately anti-militaristic perspective, celebrating General Espartero's defeat and condemning him for his bombing of the city while quelling the popular demo-anarchist riots of 1842. I'll just read an excerpt. Petitions, pleas, and supplications, writs, representations, directed by corporations have all been thrown away. Look at all the barricades that ass of a regent committed. He didn't listen to anyone but his perfidious comrades. The word barricadas, barricades, is a clear play on words, combination of the word barricades and the word burradas, that is, acting like an ass. The joke is simple enough to understand. By trying to quell those on the barricades by bombing the city, the good general was proving nothing but how much of an ass and a despot he actually was. In Madrid, where Espartero was considerably more well-loved, mostly because he didn't bomb the city with artillery, and where the industrial labor movement was not as strong, we see numerous sources from or about a later revolution in 1854, describing the odd phenomenon of the common people of Madrid both expressing affection for the regent as revolutionary hero, but also exhorting him, almost by way of warning, to remember that it is the people that brought him here and not the other way around. Here, we turn again to Barcelona and to popular songs that numerous first-person accounts recount hearing from students, young people, and laborers in the streets just prior to and after Espartero's bombardment in the winter of 1842. Here we have a song sung by laborers and students upon hearing word that the army would soon fire upon the civilian protesters with cannons. Yes, mariquita, yes, nay, mariquita, nay. They can chuck bombs all they want. My sweet darling, we're not afraid. Here we have an irreverent song against Espartero's ally, the liberal general and even more popular figurehead Juan Prim, who had also considered bombing Barcelona after a later insurrection, and who is here painted as an ally and crony of the reactionary moderate Liberal Party, who together with Prim himself must all be cooked up in a great paella, activating a kind of redistributive cannibalist imaginary in which the bodies of the military and political elite are figuratively cooked up and shared collectively among the people as one would do during Carnival, an imaginary which still persists well into the 21st century. I'll just read you a little bit of this song, translated, of course. All grown men to the paella, Mr. Prim shall soon be fried. The Queen Regent, Prim, Narvaez, and all the moderates, all in the paella, shall purge away their crimes. In short, there were indeed both cults to revolutionary prophets and militaristic cults of personality in 19th century populism. But there were also populisms that were explicitly anti-authoritarian, anti-militaristic, and anti-dictatorial, ultimately skeptical of any cult to powerful individuals, however much of a man or woman of the people they claim to be. One Jacobin novelist and statesman, today little remembered, but quite widely read in his day, if not the most widely read novelist in his day, Wenceslao Ewals de Isco, who we'll discuss more in a moment, who was censored by the conservative moderate Liberal Party for his Jacobin and abolitionist sympathies. He actually translated Uncle Tom's Cabin into Spanish. He actually advocated for dismantling the National Army altogether and replacing it with locally organized militias as part of a federalist approach to participatory and local democracy. Moving on. So the second theory I wish to test was that of the perceived synergy between anti-intellectualism and popular revolutionary activism. Here, once again, I found that things were more complicated than they seemed at first glance. Though there was indeed ample evidence of popular anti-intellectual or anti-lettered sentiment, popular criticism both towards the lettered classes and the government bureaucracy and towards the egalitarian public school system, there was simultaneously an active and growing popular movement in favor of creating spaces for public learning, whether it came in the form of petitioning the government to make the state school system free, truly free, or in the form of creating independent cultural and pedagogical spaces for workers and peasants, from the so-called asociaciones de amigos del país, which were both prevalent in Spain and in places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, to primitive workers' ateneums and republican associations. So here we're going to see some examples of popular anti-intellectualism at work. The rumored battle cry of Antoni Escoda, leader of a peasants' revolt in the town of Valls in 1845, quite explicitly calling for death to lawyers and to those who can read and write. Or here, two popular stories from anonymous pamphlets describing the utter uselessness of school, as well as the paternalistic cruelty of schoolmasters. We don't need no education, kind of thing. Or here, an example of oral expressions popular in Valencia around the turn of the 20th century, showing that many ordinary people saw school as only being good for one thing: train priests. A escola, que hi ha molta falta de retors. To school with you, there is great need for preachers. Or, a la escola, que el papa es fa vell. Go to school, the Pope is getting old. However, arguments against the universality of public education were often just as common among the upper classes and generally more conservative political factions as they were among ordinary people at large. And the conservative liberal government, which basically holds sway throughout the entire 19th century with a few exceptions, would often take great pains to obstruct plans for making public education available to all. This was pointed out, for example, by the utopian socialist activist and politician Fernando Garrido. Here, Garrido goes on to decry how the upper classes, behind their largely hollow promises to enlighten and moralize the working classes, really only wish to leave them in ignorance. There are men, he says, with great pretensions of wisdom and learnedness that are unscrupulous in declaring themselves opposed to the principle that people in general should educate themselves. Or in other words, supposedly civilized and cultured men who are wholehearted defenders of barbarism and all its consequences. One of these oracles of stupefying barbarism, while denying a permit to those who wish to construct a school for adult workers in Madrid in 1851, said these graphic words, which admirably represent the wisdom of his school, quote, "We do not need men who will think, but oxen who will work." Garrido, much like his mentor, Joaquín Abreu, translator of Charles Fourier's works on workers' associations and phalansteries, was perfectly capable of seeing the act of symbolic violence on which the legitimacy of the liberal monarchy was founded. factually denying people what he saw as their right and duty to educate themselves by refusing to build the adequate number of public schools. The regime at the same time used lack of schooling among the public at large to justify the denial of voting rights to those who weren't wealthy property owners. Quote, if you do not have concrete examples to sanction your theories, he says, speaking to the defenders of limited suffrage laws, if common sense is enough to see your own errors as the cause of greater evils than our ignorance, why do you insist in excluding us from common right? Let us enter into the Cortes and bring before them, you who already belong to that institution, an attitude of reconciliation that shall extirpate all manner of revolutions. 19th century populists were not only quite often fervent advocates of public education and active participants in pedagogical spaces not governed by the church or by the state, but themselves perfectly aware of the role of the largely privatized school system in perpetuating extant socioeconomic and political privileges. In contrast to the earlier examples of popular anti-intellectualism, here we have the voice of an anonymous worker from Alcoy, speaking in the third person in response to a government questionnaire in 1889, fully expressing the desires of him and his colleagues to give a decent education to their kids and enumerating the various obstacles laid out before them by the state and by the very fact that they are poor. Quote, having fulfilled all his sacred duties, economic duties, the worker may have 4 or 6 reales daily to share with his family, which can be between 2 and 8 people. Any unanticipated contingency, layoffs, sickness will place him in utter misery. He wants instruction for himself and for his loved ones. He cannot give it to himself for lack of resources, and this lack weighs heavily on his children. End quote. As we can see, the relationship between ordinary people and lettered culture could be at times quite rightfully tense. But this did not always preclude a desire for learning or schooling. Far from it. The desire for popular enlightenment, for the egalitarian redistribution of the means of generating cultural capital, on the contrary, formed one of the very basic premises and practices of early democratic and socialist working class cultures. And with that, we move on to the final part of the lecture. We turn to the third line of critique I wish to propose to you with regard to mainstream theories of historical populism in Spain. Concretely, the question of how the reality of socioeconomic inequality was addressed in Jacobin and utopian socialist literature. There are 2 main trends in current scholarship on these 19th century cultures. The first, what I call the anti-populist hypothesis, reads Jacobinism and utopian socialism as Manichaean populisms that fundamentally posit a discursive and symbolic logic of conflict, exclusion, and extermination, rather than acceptance of the political other. The second is what I call the classical Marxist hypothesis, which posits the supposed teleological immaturity of what they call bourgeois republicanism and utopian socialism of the early 19th century against the so-called real socialisms and class conflicts that would follow. The former trend largely dismisses or discredits Jacobin and early socialist political culture for being, in a word, too violent, proto-authoritarian, divisive in their discourse, too quick to paint people as either friends or enemies of an imagined people, and that these political cultures are a more or less direct precursor to modern day xenophobic and ultranationalistic authoritarian populisms. The Marxist school also tends to disparage these cultures, but almost for the opposite reason, claiming that so-called bourgeois Republican and utopian literature, often read by working people but not made by working people, propagated a false or innately seductive and manipulative bourgeois ideology, and hence did a fundamental disservice to what they see as true class struggle, either by advocating pacifism rather than direct action, civil disobedience, striking, etc., or by invisibilizing class conflict in their novels and pamphlets to the benefit of a fundamentally bourgeois conception of social order. In other words, that they aren't radical or populist or combative enough. Both of these theories, in my own reading of the archive, are partially correct at times, but nevertheless wholly contradictory at first glance. In my own readings of the text, I discovered discursive and aesthetic nuances that could not be fully explained by either dominant theory. In the first place, I discovered that Jacobin and utopian socialist literature, far from invisibilizing class struggle or normalizing extant structures of inequality, as the Marxists often claim, actually put that very struggle and inequality front and center. Here, for example, we see an excerpt from the 1855 sequel to the popular folletín novel María la hija de un jornalero by Wenceslao Aiguaz de Isco, who we mentioned earlier, a little known but in his day hugely popular novelist, often disregarded in contemporary scholarship for his supposedly bourgeois views on inequality and his almost reactionary defense of private property as sacred right. The title of the novel is, quite typically, El Palacio de los Crímenes o El Pueblo y sus Opresores, The People and Their Oppressors, which should make its overall populist thesis quite clear. Rather surprisingly, against the cult to private property, the author describes the revolutionary insurrection of 1854 in Madrid and the destruction of rich people's luxury items in large bonfires, quite explicitly pointing out that the so-called cólera popular, or popular ire or wrath, was in this case as just as the very wrath of God. Quote, all those fine riches and luxuries thrown from the balconies reminded the people that they weren't just the handiwork of capable artisans, but that they had been purchased with the gold stolen from the working masses. Every precious item that fell from the balconies was a provocative reminder, an intolerable insult to the proletarian classes. It was an incitation to vengeance, a way to stimulate their wrath. But this wrath was as just as the very wrath of God, end quote. This is not to downplay the more problematic views of this author and his collaborators. As translator of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you can notice, for example, a certain kind of paternalistic, a well-intentioned, quote unquote, racism. But in my mind, I think it's more important to see their work in its full complexity and contradiction, and to pay attention not only to what each individual author said in his works, but to whom, in effect, could be reading them. Here, for example, we see an excerpt from Igual de Isco's censored Republican newspaper, Guindilla, from 1843, making note of how factory workers in Valencia were actually actively discouraged by the factory owner himself from reading his articles. Some days ago, the author writes, a certain textile mill owner in Valencia told his workers, because he knows they read my newspaper, don't believe anything that ruffian tells you, for he is paid by foreigners and should have already been apprehended. To broaden the point about how so-called bourgeois, Republican, and socialist authors could be read, appreciated, and appropriated by the workers themselves for their own devices, I'm using the term appropriation in the sense that Roger Chartier uses it. Here we have a quote from the account of Manuel Pachot, a bourgeois teacher at a Barcelona workers' athenaeum in the 1860s, a decidedly conservative individual with ill or no regard for the labor movement, who complains about how impossible it is to impart a quote-unquote proper education when the workers themselves are already infested with revolutionary and atheist literature. I also discovered that Jacobins and utopian socialists of this era could have very different ideas of what revolution was and of which kinds of revolution were just or justified, and that these opinions could and very often did change over time. Narciso Monturiol, a radical Jacobin and a Icarian communist, as it so happens, inventor of the submarine, would be on literal barricades during the 1842 revolution in Barcelona, but later advocate for specifically peaceful acts of civil disobedience and labor action. He was also a notorious feminist who advocated for the abolition of capital punishment and humanitarian prison reform, as is perhaps best exemplified in the work of his largely self-taught working class protege, Alberto Columbrí. He was a typesetter. I'm going to present now a brief passage from Columbrí's autobiography. Its title is Una víctima, Memorias de un presidiario político, and it is both a recounting of his own torturous imprisonment and time in the forced labor camps and chain gangs of the liberal regime following the 1856 military coup, as well as a socialist working man's own analysis of the failures of the trade union movement in Barcelona. In this passage, he voices his initial fervent desire as a worker to have been counted among the canon of martyrs to the proletarian cause, how this initial wishful thinking was quickly overshadowed by over a year of detainment and forced labor, but ultimately of how he came to learn that fraternity, here understood as mutual aid more than specifically brotherly love, is not a mere desire or illusion, but an undeniable fact of life. And Jorge can tell us more about this later. So let's hear this populist worker philosopher in his own words. Quote, such was the state of my humor and the ardor of the fever that boiled within my mind upon my arrest, that I saw myself worthy of deserving a place of honor in the immense catalogue of martyrs to Spanish liberty. As far as my family was concerned, I wept bitterly, thinking of their sad situation, in absence of any wages I could give them while imprisoned. But my embittered heart was consoled by the idea that my good friends would surely prove the following, that though there are egotistical men that take no pleasure or sorrow in the happiness and misery of others, the word fraternity is not a word in vain to those who know that the happiness of each cannot be but the result of the happiness of all, end quote. I will conclude with an image we saw earlier. It is a print from a work by another little-known Jacobin socialist novelist, Alfonso García Tejero, called El Piuelo del Madrid. The title of the book is a variation on the figure of Le Gamin de Paris, or Boy of the Barricades, popularized in France by Delacroix and Victor Hugo. It describes the rocambolesque adventures of the eponymous Piuelo, in this case, out-of-work liberal student, and his companion Mendruguillo, literally Little Crumb, an even more impoverished student who, together with a group of blind bards who once sold comic pamphlets on street corners and who are now barred by government decree from engaging in their old work or organizing as a guild, take to putting on small puppet theater performances in the houses of political sympathizers, hopefully out of earshot of the police. In this scene, El Piuelo and Mendruguillo and the blind bards use shadow puppet theater as a means to communicate political truths that are prohibited by being heard by the state. In this case, the state's complicity with the Catholic Church as historic oppressor. The clandestine puppet theater thus becomes a way of life, a way of literally making money and being able to pay the bills at a time when free speech was actively criminalized, but also a way of living politically, of sharing, in short, the good word. As of yet, I have been unable to determine to what extent the text is autobiographical, but to me, it illustrates a very important point. Namely, that sometimes the shadows in Plato's cave can reveal far more about our world than would initially appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. I first want to thank you and thank NYU for the invitation to this event. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to comment your work and talk a little bit about mine. And I'll go right away. I think your talk about populism and utopian demo-socialism in the Romantic era was absolutely fascinating. The archive you discovered showing how the unprivileged people had very different concerns of what historians have said. That's truly amazing, especially those early anti-authoritarian and pro-literacy movements, which have definitely been underestimated in the social history of the Spanish 20th and 19th century. However, I will try to convince you, Diego, to stop using the words populism, utopian, and romantic era. This will start a debate I'm probably going to lose because you really show us your expertise in these concepts. But it might stimulate your research, and we and the audience might have some fun. And also I can't help doing it, mainly because I started studying a similar kind of objects with a similar set of concepts. And in the end, I realized I had to change one of both. The concepts or the objects. I chose to change the concepts, starting with declining the word utopia. In the next pages, I will try to explain why I did it and why did I do afterwards. And so I arrived to Princeton with a project about utopias. By that time, I thought it could be interesting to get to know some imaginations of a better future, specifically in our times when almost all fiction and nonfiction are focused on picturing dystopias. We all know what Jameson said, quoting Bruce Franklin, I guess. Today, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But it wasn't always that way. And if imagination have some power to shape reality, I thought it would be inspiring to find other ways to imagine the world, which means other ways to imagine society, economy, morality, etc. And anarchists were apparently the perfect utopians in both senses of the word. They believed in a better world, and they also in an impossible world. Or that's what historians said. I will arrive there, but before, very quick definition of anarchism and its role in Spanish history. Anarchism is a social and intellectual movement with not a single doctrine. It's a very diverse and it is very diverse and it changes through the time. But still, some basic traces could be outlined. First, anarchists consider that authority cannot be taken for granted. Authority has to be at least permanently questioned. This includes the authority given to capital, and the rich should, or given by capital. The rich should not impose their will over their workers or over anyone just because they have more capital. This is why anarchism has created some labor movements. Anarchism also believes that people can organize themselves, can organize themselves from the bottom to the top better than otherwise. And so this is why anarchists tend to favor radical democracy approaches and reject the state. In the 30s, Spanish Anarchist Union peaked to 1 million affiliates, becoming the biggest anarchist movement in world's history. Maybe tied with the Russian anarchism, which was also very good, but not so well documented. It formally started in 1868, influenced by previous social movements, those that Diego has brilliantly studied, and, and ultimately by the French Revolution, by the workers, also by the workers who had access to literacy, like typographers, and by the thought of philosophers like Proudhon in France and Mikhail Bakunin in Russia. In Spain, anarchism arrived to peasants and workers before Marxism, and it had more success until the Civil War. Actually, after Spain lost the Spanish-American War in 1898, the state was discredited and anarchism began to flourish. In 1910, they created the CNT, which soon the Confederación Nacional de Trabajadores, which soon will become the biggest trade union in Spain, winning rights for workers through strikes, such as the long strike that eventually led to the regulation of an 8-hour day in 1919, being arguably the first country acquiring that right. After the fascist coup d'etat in 1936, anarchists became very widely known because they organized militias against it, being able to stop the coup in a big industrial city like Barcelona. However, the coalition of anarchists, communists, and republicans lost the war, as you know, and by the end of it, anarchists were exiled or started to be systematically massacred by the new fascist regime. When the Francoist regime was over in the 70s, anarchism was big at the beginning, but then it declined and never recovered the importance it has before the war. Okay, this is just like a parenthesis to give the audience a little bit context of anarchism. At the same time, in the last years of Francoism, mainly in the late 60s, censorship and repression had decreased, and some Marxists and liberals had the chance to get positions into the university. Therefore, by the time the dictatorship was over, some historians have already written about pre-war social movements. Then others followed, and a big amount of books and articles have been published on Spanish anarchism since then. I started to read these books and articles, written mostly by Spanish scholars, but also by some Americans like Lily Litvak. And I soon realized that every book had exactly the same approach about the Spanish anarchist thought. That approach was, in a word, that anarchist thought simply did not exist. They pictured anarchist ideas as if they all were created by faith or feelings, never by reason. Like medieval peasants, anarchists believed in the arrival of a new millennium of glory. That's what Álvarez Junco says, for example. According to this account, anarchists never stopped to think if this was possible or how. They just believed on it. And they were very passionate. So whenever they were about to think a little bit, no way, emotions and passions dominated them, and then they started another stupid rebellion instead. Of course, there were some historians saying different things, but they were not that many, and their approach was more focused on collecting data than in creating a narrative. Therefore, the narrative of Spanish anarchism as an irrational movement was enormously successful, and it has started to change only in the last decade. So I wanted to see where this narrative came from, and I found something amazing, that everything, the whole frame, the whole story was shaped by just one man, Gerald Brennan. Gerald Brennan was an English writer related to London and Cambridge intellectuals. He was the eldest of a rich family, so after World War I, he inherited enough money to establish himself in Andalusia, in the south of Spain, in 1919. He stayed there for 7 years and then got back home. Years after, in 1943, he finished his most famous book, The Spanish Labyrinth. The book was published 4 years after the terrible civil war in Spain. Brennan talks about different political traditions, but he dedicates the biggest part of it to anarchism. Brennan does so because he thought anarchism was the perfect representation of the Spanish mentality, which is, in the end, for him, a religious mentality. His thesis goes this way. Spain is a very Catholic country. It had Inquisition in the past. It still has many churches. And people were so ignorant in the 19th century that by the time secularization arrived, these peasants and workers simply changed the faith in God for the faith in anarchy, in an ideal society like millenarians. And then they used anarchism as a substitute for their rigid Christian morality, like Puritans, saying things against alcohol and prostitution. Depending on which part of Brennan's book you open, anarchists are fervent Catholics, or are like Protestant Puritans, or are like medieval Anabaptists. Brennan's view about Spain comes from the typical British readings about the Spanish Inquisition, Cervantes, Calderón de la Barca, and other classics of the 17th century. He also plagiarizes parts of a written book by a notary, Juan Díaz del Moral, who also wrote about peasant revolts and anarchism. It's then not Brennan's book, it's not a scholarly book, not even a serious book, but it is very well written. Brennan was a writer after all, and he created a great narrative. And it was published by Cambridge University Press. So it became a bestseller, both inside and outside academia. Then, 16 years later, in 1956, another bestseller gets published, Primitive Rebels by Eric Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm dedicates a chapter to Andalusian anarchists, and almost everything is grounded on Gerald Brennan. He adds some more theory on millenarianism by Norman Cohn to reinforce the idea that these anarchists thought in the same way as medieval peasants. The word primitive by Hobsbawm is a metaphor for non-Marxist, because he's a Marxist. He basically built a map of social movements that have been overcome by the rationality and organization of Marxist parties and trade unions, the ones he supported. So after these two bestsellers were published, the European narrative about anarchism in Spain has already been established. Anarchism had been something backward, irrational, moralistic, and millenarian. Finally, in 1976, La Ideología Política del Anarquismo Español was published. It's a big, very well-written book. It's the book that everyone quoted ever since. Today, after 40 years, nobody questions it. It definitely established the theoretical frame about Spanish anarchism. The book has 20 chapters discussing anarchist ideas on liberty, progress, nature, culture, tracing some genealogies, some socialism, some liberal ideas, and those are the genealogies for him, for Álvarez Junco, the author. Everything, in the end, everything, and also everything Gerald Brennan said 20 years before, that anarchists were moralistic, irrational, passionate, everything. And also millenarians, maybe. No, Alvarez discusses Brennan and Hobsbawm and concludes that they weren't right. At least in this point, millenarianism is something too old. So just because you believe in a better future, you don't go right away to medieval times. Instead, anarchists were, for Álvarez Junco, utopians. And what does it mean to be utopian for him? Well, exactly everything that Brennan and Hobsbawm said about millenarianism. Many years later, in an article in 2010 that summarized the book that he wrote 34 years ago, he complements the utopian adjective with one more, redemptorists. What does it all mean in the book? That Alvarez doesn't talk about what anarchists thought about science, but instead about their faith on science, or their faith in progress and culture. Their cult on progress, as Diego said. According to Alvarez, anarchists don't debate about how to reach harmony. They all believed in harmony as a principle. They had a blind faith on harmony. Why? Why? What's the argument for Álvarez Junco to this? That because Rousseau said so. It's history of ideas. So that's the argument by Alvarez. Anarchists inherited the Rousseauian belief in a state of nature before modernity, in which everyone lives peacefully, and this is what they did for him. So, but Alvarez never proves this. Anarchists actually didn't quote Rousseau, and if they do so, like as Kropotkin did, they are opposed to Rousseau. This is what he did is like finding correlation of ideas, but in his mind, but not a real causality, right, in the archive. And the other problem is that he lives outside many other genealogies, people that anarchists already quoted. French novelists like Victor Hugo, as Diego said, Eugène Sue, Émile Zola, anthropologists, geographers, evolutionists. Anarchists were not reading Locke, as the author of the book did in his political science major. They preferred to read novels talking about the working class and lots of science. They translated the scientists, they had meetings to discuss their last findings, etc. Since anarchists had to exile many times after publishing forbidden books, traveled a lot, especially to France, England, and Argentina, learning French and English. England, the most permissive country, was their main refuge. Refugee, and they were then even if they were blue-collar workers, they were a very cosmopolitan part of the Spanish society. The bottom line is utopianism, millenarianism, populism, all of them appeal to feelings, and all of them say in the end that the working class people are not able to think. Therefore, under this frame, it's hard to get to know how these people reasoned or or reasoned to do what they did. We will debate later about populism, but for now, I just want to say that we are writing in the present, and we're not going to change the present meaning of the words. And it took me a while to assimilate this, because I wanted to change the meaning of utopia and give like a most favor, like a better perspective of it. But in the end, it means that something is impossible, right? That's what when you use that's utopian, it's like, okay, you're not going to get it, right? And the present meanings of utopia or populism are linked to actually to irrationality. So when seen under these words, workers and peasants get linked with irrationality, even if we don't want to. And this facet of the working classes has already been widely studied. So this is why I try to focus on their thought, on unfolding how they reasoned. And linked to irrationalism, there is another big prejudice about the working classes, which is that they were always struggling for life and therefore fighting between each other. And therefore, that they needed to be controlled by those who are more rational. So this is why I discarded utopia and focused my dissertation on the word solidarity, on how this solidarity between workers was lived, but especially how it was thought by them at the time. Okay, because workers spent most of their lives in a very cooperative society, historians like Chris Ilham and Dolores Marin have shown that solidarity articulated the day-to-day life of the working classes beyond the specific conflicts highlighted by the bourgeois press and literature. This can be seen by reading against the grain the accounts of external observers such as Blasco Ibáñez or Baroja. And in addition to articulating daily life, mutual support was the basis for organizing as a protest movement. But how workers thought about this solidarity? This is the main thing I was focused on the dissertation. First, from a scientific point of view, the anarchists of 19 of the beginning of the 19th century obtained their conclusions to a great extent from the empirical observation of nature made by Russian naturalists, collected and disseminated by Pyotr Kropotkin or Eliseo Reclus. We cannot forget that Kropotkin works were the best-seller non-fiction books from at least the first 30 years in the 20th century. I promise, I spent weeks in the Spanish National Library to check this. These studies by Russian naturalists brought by Kropotkin, even if inspired by Darwin's natural selection, were able to put aside the British individualistic theories that contaminated the origin of species. Instead, they put cooperation against the harsh condition of the environment in the center, giving birth to the idea of ecosystems and therefore to a scientific paradigm that later will have great relevance in disciplines as diverse as neuroscience, primatology, archaeology, evolutionary biology, and epistemology itself. In the sciences, concepts such as mirror neurons, mutualism, altruism, reciprocity, feelings of social preference, extra-family upbringing, group mentality, social emotions, civic predisposition, etc., have proliferated in recent decades. Actually, they are also affecting the social sciences too, questioning very established notions such as the tragedy of the commons, or giving new alternatives to the famous prisoner's dilemma. As Bowles and Gintis affirm in a recently published book, the editors of the prestigious journal Science put the evolution of cooperative behavior as one of the most eluded questions by current scientists. Secondly, from a philosophical point of view, putting solidarity at the center means doing it on a linkage, not on a subject. Decentering the being and its metaphysics, it's a great achievement of analytical and postmodern philosophies, but also part of the anarchist project. In their case, they didn't speak about language games as like Wittgenstein, or body fluids like Deleuze, or soccer passes like Bruno Latour, but they also relied on materialistic metaphors obtained from observing life and the objects around them. It is the case of Fernando Garrido, since he sees the human organism as if it were an electricity cable that transmits an impression, doing it with more or less intensity. Or that Enrique Yuri, a disciple of Ramon y Cajal, who explained the world from neural networks that he investigated. Positivism might not be as far from post-structuralism as one could think then. We can also look at Jean-Marie Guyot, who observed in nature and in the human being something that biology continues to postulate today, that the main pulse of living beings is fertility, not self-preservation, as utilitarian posits. There are species in which the male dies during or after intercourse, as in the case of mantises. But there is none that renounces to reproduce, to expand, to create, to give away. The universal impulse is that of fertility, of generosity, says Guyot, observing nature and the society around him. And, um, and not the will of power, as Nietzsche postulated at the same time after studying the history of the elites. Finally, from a political point of view, understanding solidarity as an innate impulse, as a factor of human evolution itself, allowed anarchists to question all the ideologies that appropriated solidarity to justify various forms of domination and inequality. I'm talking about ideologies like Christianity, nationalism, or conservatism. They all perform the same type of operation with respect to human nature, postulating that the main innate impulse is to humiliate or destroy one's neighbor. And from there, establish that coexistence and cooperation are possible only thanks to religious morality, the patriotic spirit of unity, or the regulatory state. However, anarchists discover something that archaeologists later confirm, that coexistence and cooperation already existed before religion, before the state, and before the nation. And they argued that precisely the institution of religion, state, and patriotism have been a main reason for wars and massacres, even that their promoters later, events, these wars and massacres, that their promoters later attribute to human nature. And this is why anarchists place so much emphasis on knowledge and thought, aligned closely with scientists, sociologists, Freemasons, and freethinkers, because the goal is to shed the layers of fanaticism and misinformation that they identify with religion and nationalism, and that guide human species towards mistrust and mutual destruction. The anarchism of this time does not try then to make men better, but to make them more intelligent, more advanced in their own words, because they understand that an intelligent person knows that he or she will feel more accomplished when cooperating and favoring others, rather than humiliating or destroying people. This is an anarchist point that has been understood, in my opinion, completely the other way around. Kropotkin, for example, does not advocate how to moralize society, because society to him already has an innate morality, which is the result of natural evolution. Instead, he focuses on how to stop demoralizing society through prison punishment, inequality, or wars. The instrument of anarchists then is not the Christian preaching that one has to be good, but the free thought that allows the deconstruction of demoralizing ideas and practices. But in addition, among these demoralizing ideas, capitalism amplified a new revolutionary ideology by the turn of the 19th century, which no longer sought to appropriate mutual support, but to deny it in the name of unlimited human freedom. I understand that the success of the individualism by Nietzsche is interesting because his positions were similar to those that prevail today in this neoliberal era. It is therefore necessary to look at the present from those debates of 100 years ago. I'm talking about the notion of freedom that is understood as an ultimate good of an isolated individual that is obtained through capital and that is expressed through the consumption of experiences and objects. Most of Spanish anarchists propose an alternative notion of liberty. They understood freedom literally as a principle, as a permanent beginning, but not as an ultimate end. Moreover, they thought liberty as the only principle capable of originating an authentic responsibility towards the other, instead of an imposed one. This is clearly seen in the debate that took place almost for a year in the magazine Natura in 1904, in which majority of anarchism rejects the individualistic doctrines of Nietzsche, so attractive among the bourgeois intellectuals of the 98 generation or the 98 group. And this, very roughly, were most of the concerns and thoughts of the anarchists in the early 20th century in Spain, which I think connect in many ways to the archive Diego has unveiled, but not maybe with the hegemonic narrative that I think. And I think these concepts that are part of this hegemonic narrative are still sometimes in Diego's talk. To summarize these anarchist movements, this historiography sees, without demonstrating it, that Christian moralism were there as they see Christian moralism where there was an attempt to record and question the origin of morality. They see, without proving it either, the myth of the state of nature of Rousseau, where there is a problematization of the myth of the state of nature of Hobbes by relying on the science of the time. And these historians, they see only fanaticism and essentialism in a movement that was very close to the free-thinking movement and in a phase of a powerful theoretical transformation and self-questioning. This is why I believe that concepts such as utopia, romanticism, millenarianism, cults, and even populism are not the most helpful ones to understand the Spanish working classes or the unprivileged people of the 19th century. So I will ask you some questions, and the first would be, do you agree with my point? Do you share with me that a set of tools related to reason and not only to emotions and faith could be more helpful to understand the thoughts and action of the people you analyze, or at least to understand the facets that have not been considered by most of these historians so far? Second, you refer to the 19th century as the Romantic era. To what extent would you say the novels and tales you read were romantic? When studying the last decade of the century, I found that most of the unprivileged people were seduced by positivism. Since Comte, the father of positivism, belongs to the first half of the century, did you find any trace of that intellectual movement in your archive? And last, in your research, what are the intellectual traditions behind the claims to provide literacy to the people?
Sorry, could you repeat the last question?
Yes, in your research, what are the intellectual traditions behind the claims to provide literacy to the people?
What are the intellectual traditions that fuel?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. So where to start? Let's start with religion and Romanticism. Um, I prepared a little bit of something just to give me an idea. Some notes I've been taking while you were talking, Jorge. Um, right. So, and this is controversial, but I think in a way, and again, not to take Carl Schmitt, a Nazi, at his word, which I think is part of the problem with a lot of populist critique or analysis today, or criticisms of populism. They kind of take Carl Schmitt, a Nazi, at his word, and that is very problematic. But not to agree too strongly with that, I think that all political movements are to some extent religious. It can be argued as they pertain to the organization of the religio, no? Which at its most basic level means community. What made anarchism unique, like radical Jacobinism before, was these cultures' ability, like you say, to radically and critically question authority, authorship, and ultimately cults of personality. It is not that there aren't personality cults in Jacobinism and anarchism. I think even a cursory look will demonstrate otherwise. Durruti was a hero. He was a freaking hero. He was idolized. Bakunin
Reference.
was idolized. Proudhon as well. Marxism has its own cults. I kind of put them in the same picture to prove the point. So it's not that there aren't personality cults in Jacobin and anarchism, like there clearly are in Marxism or in liberalism or in any really modern political culture. But that these are cultures, in addition to developing sometimes structures of worship for some leaders, activists, or abstract ideas like progress, enlightenment, emancipation, fraternity, solidarity, etc. They also, Jacobinism and anarchism also tend towards iconoclasm and that radical questioning of the sacred image. For Republicans, I think the breaking of the sacred image of the king is key. And in the United States, many 18th century American Republicans are pretty clear in their disdain for the idea of the president becoming a kind of a new democratically elected or semi-democratically elected king. For anarchists and many critical socialists, I prefer the term critical socialist to utopian, the iconoclasm is, I think, more sophisticated because it extends to basically any aspect, any institution, any everyday practice. I think socialist feminists in particular are very good about pointing out forms of oppression that are less obvious than just king and subject, like republicanism, classical Jacobinism does. It can be gender roles. It can be, machista violence, that kind of thing. So, I mean, to call something religious, I try to say that, not in the sense of kind of the old positivist Marxist tradition of saying, if it's religious, it must be superstitious, it must be primitive, it must be bad. But no, rather kind of like what David Graeber, the late anarchist anthropologist we associate with Occupy, he saw in popular religion a kind of, not a primitive version, but a very sophisticated precursor and early example of what we call popular democratic egalitarian mass movements today. So just because something is religious doesn't mean it's bad. With regard to Romanticism, that's a very interesting question. As with religion, I'd like to say, why do we always assume it must be a bad thing just because it has been used as a way to discredit anarchism? They say, oh, anarchism is just Romanticism. Old school republicanism is just Romanticism. Well, okay, but is that bad in itself? It's sort of like when that's socialism. Well, maybe there's not so much bad in there as we believe. I think that there are different types of romanticism. There's the sort of heteronormative romantic love, rightfully questioned by queer scholars and feminists in recent decades. I fully agree it needs criticizing. There's also the romanticization of the poor and the working classes, what we tend to associate with Victor Hugo, early real socialist realism, miserabilism, which can hearken in itself to kind of Rousseau's racist and classist myth of the noble savage. There's that kind of romanticization. There's also landscape, literary and artistic romanticism, that what Raymond Williams talks about in The Country of the City, in which fundamentally bourgeois metropolitan authors romanticize nature and paint the illusion of a pristine nature, supposedly untouched by human hands, at the same time that colonized people and peasants are being actively displaced and dispossessed from those very landscapes. So this are some things that come to mind when we hear the word romanticism, but I think there are other romanticisms. Not so much Victor Hugo himself, who is an individual, had very problematic thoughts on workers' rights and on the rights of colonized people, but Les Miserables in the hands of a self-taught mill worker or a Cuban revolutionary. That's a different kind of romanticism. Or in Spain, in Galicia, a poet like Rosalía de Castro, who professes a certain love for ordinary people, a romantic kind of, I wouldn't say if I struggle to call it romantic love, but she's associated with romanticism, so I use the word. A certain love for ordinary people, a love for the land, a love for the landscape, but who also knows that that land, that landscape isn't theirs. It doesn't belong to the people who actually work it. So she's a poet who uses the Galician landscape, as Germán Labrador and María do Febreiro argue, to communicate memories of dispossession and resistance to oppression by the very people forced to immigrate by the kind of the extant property regime. Let's see, next, positivism, the role of positivism. I think that's a very interesting question, and I see it. Particularly in the slide where I showed these different prints from the Jacobin novels. You know, you have the cult to progress and scientific learning. You have the cult to liberty, the abstracted idea of liberty. But different from what I would say Bonapartist aesthetic, you don't connect it to a leader, to a politician. You connect it to ordinary people. So I think, you know, there's a kind of popular or at least populist positivism that develops within early republicanism, utopian socialism, and anarchism that, you know, conceives of the relationship differently. It's not that there are wise people who later impart and enlighten. It's that enlightenment is itself something that belongs to the people. So are there any concrete traditions that I see that associated with? I mean, Comte is read among, I don't know to what extent Comte, Saint-Simon, because Comte was a disciple of Saint-Simon. I don't know to what extent they're really popularized, but for example, I think the number one kind of utopian socialist, essayist, propagandist, Ramon de la Sagra, he's definitely thinking about Comte. And he's definitely kind of helping to, if not popularize, at least kind of disseminate this among other socialist and progressive intellectuals. And there was another point I wanted to address, which is not really a question you asked, but on the idea of solidarity and mutual aid as a fact of life, which I see fully present in Jacobinism, just as it is in anarchism. It's a different idea of naturalism, not that we are all individuals in this constant inevitable struggle, but that no, altruism is real. I think the terminologies were different. Anarchists probably used the word solidarity more. It had been in vogue longer. Jacobins and early socialists of my time would probably use the word fraternity or harmony. But they absolutely believed it was real. But here's the trick. Activists, especially when they knew they were in the minority, like maybe the movement could grow, but they saw themselves in the minority. They knew that mutual aid and solidarity were real facts of life, but that they were also precarious. They had limits. That when solidarity breaks down, because there's so much pressure on it to break down, that struggle for life becomes inevitable. And I'll give one example. Albert Columbri, the self-taught typesetter that I talked about, that I quoted earlier, he said this in his criticism of trade unionism to advocate for the creation of a broader union, an international. He said that the mutual aid society workers turn to during a strike, you know, we don't go to work, we help each other, we share money, we share food, we share resources as long as the strike goes on. That mutual aid society is great and it's essential, but it can't compete with the mutual aid society of the ruling class. They will always have more ability to outlast the strike as long as it remains individual. That's why the movement fundamentally needed to grow. It needed to grow to all social classes and all industries. So just that little point where I don't disagree, but I would add that little caveat that you can have people who recognize that altruism is natural, inevitable, an inextricable part of life, and who also recognize how fragile capitalism or relations of domination can make that at times. That sometimes you're kind of forced to struggle against what you know should be your real being in the world.
All right, thank you, Diego. Great answers. Okay, about romanticism. First, I didn't say that has to be bad. Instead, I just asked if you found that on your subjects. I would say that, like, yeah, someone said like Rosalia de Castro used it, but she wasn't. I mean, we cannot say that she was part of the working classes, which is what
No.
or I mean, the most privileged part of the societies. And but but what my concern is that sometimes Romanticism, which praises individualism, it's hard to put it together with solidarity or fraternity, right? And I think it could, of course, that can be like a good Romanticism, as you showed, but I think it was more of a movement of bourgeois people that talked about landscapes, or even connected to material things like Rosalia, but that kind of people, right? And so of course solidarity can get broken, and that's something they know, they see all the time. But that's why that's okay. Just 1 minute. That's why Kropotkin talks about demoralization. I think that when this solidarity gets broken, right? And also, you said religion. Okay, we can understand religion as religare or something, as community, right? But that's the same thing. It's like populism. Of course, we can understand populism in a different way, and also utopia and everything. But in the end, that's not what people think. That's not what the term that the meaning of that we're sharing, both inside and outside academia. So I think that those are battles that are very hard to win. That's my point of the lecture, right? That I'm not discussing that your way to talk about populism is wrong. It's totally right. And I actually I studied myself the Russian populism, and it's amazing. But I think that to some extent you are using the same vocabulary that all the historians you are criticizing were using, and it's hard to give a new meaning to every word they used, right?
If I can speak briefly to that point, because I know we have to open to questions. I mean, one sort of kind of a mentor that governed my own reading of the archive was Roger Chartier. His idea of appropriation, or reappropriating something that has been used to disparage, or that's typically read in a different way. In a way, your option to reread your archive was to simply not use these words. Why do we have to keep using the same words that are used to disparage them? In a way, I took a slightly different approach, was to say, well, why can't we reappropriate them in their original definitions? Populism, for instance, in the Russian populist definition of the word, not as ideology, ignorant, brainwashed people being consumed, blah, 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 but ordinary people thinking and reading for themselves. I was very interested in doing something like that. And well, it is true, like a lot of these romantic populist works, I call them romantic and populist, which is not to say that they aren't popular. Many of them are quite well read, widely read and appreciated by those ordinary people that you talk about. Victor Hugo, the bourgeois guy who writes about Les Miserables, is one thing. An actual proletarian in Paris, maybe an immigrant from Haiti, who picks up Les Miserables and reads it for himself, that's quite another. Rosalia, she came from a petty bourgeois family, kind of precarious when you consider, I don't know, contemporaries, other feminist authors she's associated with, like Pardo Bazán, who's a high aristocrat, right? But she was very active, or at least had active correspondence with the Madrid Bohemia. And we're talking about, yes, bourgeois authors, but who precisely because they wrote subversive things, they were subject to closures, being censored. One I'm studying, who was a friend of Rosalia de Castro, would actually be evicted from his house twice. I'm in the process of writing an article on these sort of evicted members of the lettered classes who sort of never, attained the kind of popularity, the ability to live from what they wrote. But I think what you're addressing, Jorge, is very important. I'm also very, very skeptical about the use of these words, which is why I put them in quotations. I kind of like to let my reader or my audience make up their own mind. Um, but just to say, I admire your own work tremendously. Your own reading your own thesis was kind of a guide for me as well, one among many voices that I hope to evoke. So yeah, just that to thank you so much for your reading and the attention you gave to this.
Thank you. Same for me. I learned a lot today.
Okay, thank you so much, Diego and Jorge, for such a vibrant conversation. I have been listening and really enjoying the debate. As a result of your vigorous debate and the many questions that it has elicited, we actually don't have time to answer all of the questions that are on the board. So I'm going to make a decision, which is to ask a question that we received that is not in the Facebook comments, because I think that Diego and Jorge, you could go back perhaps and look at the comments and read the two questions that are posted there that are, as your own question and answer has brought forth really discursive questions and answers, so too have the questions that have come on the board, which is to say that they aren't one-word questions. So I'm going to just pose one, advise that we just have a few minutes to answer it, and then we'll probably have to close up our program. So this question comes from Sarah Nadal, and I'm going to read her question, and then hopefully both Diego and Jorge might answer briefly to Sarah, and then I'll ask that you address the other questions that are on the board, perhaps in the chat yourselves. So Sarah asks, would it be possible to rethink the polysemy of populism so that some categories pose problems that others attempt to answer? For instance, if populism names the difficulty and anxiety over the emergence of the many, the masses, as an emotional political subject that carries a potential for opacity and illegibility, could we see the appeals to cathexis and antagonism as attempts to foreclose that difficulty, to unify the multiple by resorting up residual forms of representation?
Okay. Rethinking this polysemia so that some of the definitions actually counter what the aporias that the other ones sort of leave in their wake. I fully agree, and that's in a sense what I attempted to do by showing this primitive, not primitive, Jorge, sorry, this early permutation of populism in Russia. The first definition of populism we have comes from the Russian populists, and it's precisely the opposite idea of this mainstream kind of hegemonic narrative of ignorant people. So I tried to do that just by the categories themselves. I didn't want to kind of push anyone in one direction or another, because I think the Stoic hypothesis, which can be aristocratic, which can be classist, the ignorant multitudes, people don't have an education, this kind of thing. If it's articulated in that way, it's absolutely that. It's just a reproduction of the same sorts of symbolic violence and real violence that we're used to. But the problem of propaganda is real. What you call propaganda versus what you call authentic information. I think Russian populists, I think the working class cultures of the 19th and 20th century were trying to really create their own scientific discipline that, while still being empirical and rational, would in a way combat the supposed empirical rationality of the dominant kind of liberal culture. And I don't know if I answered all parts of that question. The last part about cathexis, I'm not sure how to respond. I don't know if Jorge, you'd like to weigh in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, very quick. I think the question was claiming for the definition of populism by Ernesto La Claude. It was very close, I think. And I think that's a great example of my point. We had in Spain a party that was very grounded on La Claude's work, and they had a huge visibility. They talk all the time about populism, trying precisely to change the meaning of populism, trying to reject the demagogic, the hypothesis, as you said, Diego, that means that in Spain, basically, populism means that a politician say things good to the people that he cannot later support, right? So I think in the US it's kind of different, and I'm not gonna do that. So we have this party for years trying to change this view, and they didn't succeed. Right now it's the same. And so I think it's a great example that we cannot dispute those terms, or we can, but it's not very likely that we're going to succeed. That would be my point.
I think we can dispute them in academia, because academia is not segregated from the public sphere. I mean, things that people publish, Álvarez Juncos or Antonio Lorza's works that we criticize a good deal, both of us, it does have a certain repercussion into how this is addressed more broadly in the public sphere. And I think words can change their meaning in a certain way. I think there was one part of the question which addressed this idea of inevitable struggle. And that in itself is an entire lecture or discussion that Jorge and I could have a different time.
Yeah.
Like any of you that we could have.
Well,
but I will say this. How to put it? I think there is a key difference between sort of populism at its most basic anti-elitist discourse expression. We are the 99%. Majority versus minority, poor versus rich, or non-rich versus rich. There is a greater complexity and a potential for coalition. There's a lot of people that can belong to that 99% than there is, say, in authoritarian ultranationalist populism of the right, whether we're talking about Donald Trump or the Nazis. There are very clearly people who are excluded, or even in some authoritarian Marxist-Leninist regimes, I think. But that sort of intuition that there are those above and those below, it does posit a struggle. It does posit at the very least a tension, something that is not right. But I don't think it necessarily has to be the logic of extermination, exclusion of all political otherness. I think there's a key difference there that gets elided in the current debate. That's what I would say with regard to this question of struggle.
Yeah. Also too, as the questions themselves demonstrate, and I'd encourage, both of you to look at the questions. Even the questions themselves are so multi-layered and multidimensional that, as you both have raised, the nomenclature itself generates discourse, but then of course also historicizing that nomenclature is so important as we move forward. So I just want to again thank both of you for bringing such important issues to a discussion, for the rich archive that you brought forward for all of us to discuss, and to thank the people who are watching and pose questions. This is a discussion, as you said, that could go on for hours, if not days and decades, and hundreds of years that we have seen. So just to thank you again for your attention to history, to historiography, to teaching and sharing with us all that you have researched, and thank everyone listening. And we look forward to further conversations in the future. Obviously, these aren't questions that end here. So just again, to thank you both for your wonderful contributions to these debates. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordana.
Thank you all for being here. And Jorge, thank you for coming and sharing this with me.
Thank you, Diego.